and politically fragile environments. He is also interested in educational challenges in context of mass displacement. Currently, he is leading a research project on higher education and peace building in Somaliland, researching the idea and possibilities of future education for Syrian refugees and vulnerable populations in Lebanon, and also a study into social movement learning involving four social political movements in Colombia, Nepal, South Africa, and Turkey. He is now a visiting fellow of the Multicultural Studies and Social Innovation Center, the Institute of Asian Studies, Chulalongkorn University. He is researching on education, conflict, and peace building in the three southernmost provinces of Thailand. Please welcome Associate Professor Tejendra Pherali.
Thank you, Chowin, for that very elaborated introduction. I'm not very used to listening to such a flowery introduction because we're too informal back in the UK. I'm really delighted to be here. Professor Sunait Chintiranand, Director of the Multicultural Studies and Social Innovation Center, Institute of Asian Studies, Chulalongkorn University. Panelists and conference delegates. First of all, I'm grateful to the Institute of Asian Studies for hosting me as a visiting scholar, and to the Multicultural Center for inviting me to deliver this keynote at this conference. I would like to congratulate the Center for putting together such an interesting conference program. We live in the world that is increasingly globalized, interconnected, and interdependent. After the World War II, global social, economic, and political processes have been largely dominated by ideas of modernization, in which the developing world has been steered towards achieving the Western-style democracy, economic development, and cultural homogenization. However, in recent decades, in many countries around the world, including in Western democracies, there has been a backlash on neoliberal capitalism, as the benefit of economic development have been ripped off by a small minority of the top richest quintile, whereas the hard-working middle class and people living in deprived areas have seen very limited change in their life conditions. Cultural homogenization, along the principles of consumerism, has undermined diverse identities, traditional values, ways of life, people's relationships with indigenous knowledge, land, and territories. As a result, I would argue, we are beginning to see the rise of ethno-nationalism and far-right politics, not only in Europe and North America, but also in other parts of the world, such as Turkey and my own home country, Nepal. In many countries, such as my own native Nepal, national homogenization processes and assimilationist national policies have undermined cultures, values, and traditions of diverse cultural groups who feel marginalized by the state and have resorted to violence as a means to claim their share in the state. In this conjuncture, critical understanding of multiculturalism has never been more important before than now. Skiba defines multiculturalism as coexistence of many cultures in one social space and period. Meanwhile, culture, ethnic or national, is understood as a system of behavioral patterns, values, standards, ideas, and their products, existing, transformed, or created, internalized, used in social life process. The idea of multiculturalism, simply as a collection of different cultures, doesn't reach out to the complexity of interactions that occur between different cultural groups. Diversity is richness and social asset when there is recognition and mutual respect between cultures. And there are legally binding mechanisms to ensure political representation and justice through the formal state. However, the domination of the majority culture on minorities can only fuel discontent and frustration, leading to socio-political instability. Multiculturalism, not simply a national declaration, it requires concerted efforts by members of cultural communities and the state to cultivate respect and recognition, as well as equitable access to political and economic opportunities. It goes without saying that ill-managed multiculturalism fuels social tensions, which can lead to violent conflicts. Education in such environments is an important domain that can become victim as schools and educational actors are attacked during conflict. As a perpetrator, as education is controlled and utilized to promote monoculture and repress diversity. And as a peace builder, as it is also seen as a vehicle to maintain stability and address the causes of conflict. In this talk, I try to discuss some debates about education in conflict-affected multicultural societies, where the provision of education is fundamentally caught between rights-based claims about access to quality learning and complexities around context, histories, and politics of education. I attempt to demonstrate how education interacts with different dimensions of conflict, and then argue that education should be conceptualized both as a process of dismantling conflict-inducing structures in society and as a process of promoting critical inquiry, respect for diversity, social justice principles, and skills for civic and political engagement. In the last 2 decades, the interdisciplinary field of education and conflict has grown exponentially, departing from the original idea of the 2 phases of education. And the pioneering theoretical work by Lynn Davis that analyzes the complex interaction between education and conflict using complexity theory. Although the central arguments still broadly feature the role of education in conflict and peace, new theoretical frameworks and analytical approaches have also emerged lately to engage with multidimensional interactions between education and humanitarian interventions, Islamist insurgencies, the war on terror, and refugee situations. The fact that this field emerged out of urgent needs to provide educational solutions in context of insecurity, extreme poverty, and social and emotional breakdown of populations whose lives were shattered by emergencies, the research and policy analysis is often tasked with not only the promotion of theoretical innovations, but also providing practical solutions that could improve practice. For example, the Multicultural Studies and Social Innovation Centers at Chulalongkorn has just carried out a research project that aimed at designing educational materials that could be used by schools to promote peace in southern provinces of Thailand. Broadly speaking, global debates about education and conflict, research priorities and questions regarding professional practice in the field can loosely be organized under 2 main areas. So the first one is the provision of education in conflict and protracted crisis, and the second, the role of education in fueling conflict or promoting peace. Firstly, the world has experienced the historic level of mass exodus since the World War II. By the end of 2017, 68.5 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide, and the refugee population, including the 5.4 million Palestinian refugees under the mandate of UNRWA, reached 25.4 million. I quote UNHCR here. Out of 6 million primary and secondary aged refugee children under the UNHCR's mandate, 3.7 million are out of school, and refugee children generally are 5 times more likely to be out of school than non-refugee children. As compared to the global primary enrollment of 90%, only 50% of the primary aged refugee children have the same opportunity. Merely 22% of refugee adolescents have access to lower secondary schools, and dismally 1% of refugees attend tertiary education, compared to 34% globally. Secondly, education is an integral part of the national and global political and economic agenda. These interests influence the processes of educational governance and politics, such as educational goals, access, quality, and equity among children representing diverse social groups, distributions of educational resources, questions about gender equity, language of instruction, pedagogy, curriculum, and assessment. Francis Stewart argues that multidimensional inequalities between culturally defined groups, defined as horizontal inequalities, that determine resource access and outcomes, predict instability and violent conflict. Along the same theoretical lines, the societies with greater educational inequalities between culturally defined groups have substantially higher risk of conflict, and particularly the prevalence of high education inequality between ethnic and religious groups doubles the likelihood of experiencing violent conflict. This is a research carried out by FHI 360 and published in 2016. However, governments in conflict-affected and fragile societies tend to embrace market-based neoliberal policies that show little enthusiasm towards reconfiguration of unequal socio-economic structures and to address problems of inequalities. Consequently, development interventions in such contexts are likely to be complicit in maintaining the hegemony of the privileged political class rather than transforming them, while the global inequalities are also rising amidst the unjust, divisive, and environmentally destructive global capitalist system. And I quote Thomas Piketty's work here. Mark Duffield argues development is increasingly practiced under the notion of security biopolitics, in which the West has both a security interest and a value-based desire to secure, to develop, to protect, and to better the other, whose insecurity threatens the security of Western consumer society, as the instabilities associated with conflict, poverty, and alienation threaten to spill over into and to destabilize the West. Education aid and programming are largely implicated within these broad development aims and processes, and hence it is pertinent that the role of education and development be critically scrutinized within these frameworks. The inception of the field of education in emergencies is predicated on the idea that education is a human right. Children have the right to education even during times of crisis, and the provision of education must not stop under any circumstances. Education is also commonly seen as a conduit for rights, a necessary prerequisite to the exercising and defending of one's own and others' rights, and individuals hold certain rights within the educational experience or institution. And I quote my colleague Tristan McCowan here. In conflict-affected and protracted crisis, education serves as the only hope to escape from the predicament. The protracted crisis, education serves as the only hope, so the guiding framework For this conviction is based on the principles of 4 A's: that education is available for free and supported by necessary infrastructure. It is accessible to all, including the most marginalized. Acceptable in terms of its content, cultural appropriateness and fairness, and adaptable to meet the needs of children who live in crisis contexts. And I quote Tomaszewski's work here. There are 3 main motivations for promoting education as a human right. Firstly, children are often victims of war, and education serves as a mechanism of child protection, as guaranteed by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Secondly, it helps build an international solidarity to advocate for educational rights of vulnerable and most marginalized populations. Finally, without guaranteeing an uninterrupted access to good quality education for all, including in context of conflict and refugee crisis, it would be impossible to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 4 on education, by 2030. Schools, children, and teachers are often targeted purposely by conflicting groups in many parts of the world. In 74 countries in the last 4 years, schools and universities, their students and teachers have been intentionally targeted for attack, or education facilities have been used for military purposes, of which 28 countries experienced more than 20 violent attacks on education. So there's a coalition, global coalition on protecting education from attack, which publishes reports every year, which documents violent attacks on education. As educational institutions represent the state and the government in power, rebel groups target schools to challenge the authority, to defy certain educational policies, for example, curriculum and language policies, or to challenge education's core principles, for example, girls' education in Afghanistan. Attacks on schools and children also serves as a propaganda tool for extremist groups. For example, in April 2014, 329 Nigerian girls were kidnapped by Boko Haram, an extremist group that is resisting the provision of modern education that is perceived as a repression of Islamic values and culture. In 2015, Al-Shabaab, a Somali militant group, attacked Garissa University College in Kenya, killing 148 students as a revenge of Kenyan government's military deployment in Somalia. Similarly, the attack by Tehrik-e-Taliban on the army public school in Peshawar, Pakistan in 2014 killed 149 people, including 132 children. In Afghanistan, schools are targeted by the Taliban and Islamic State fighters to undermine the state control of public services such as education. And I quote my work in Afghanistan previously. In emergencies, education serves as an enabling force, as space to improve children's health through school vaccination and nutrition programs. Schools can be used to provide clean water, sanitation, and shelter, and organize peace education and conflict resolution programs, as well as education for disaster risk reduction. A progressive access and outcomes in education prepares young people with relevant knowledge and skills to get employment and gain stable livelihoods, enables them to access transnational opportunities, and facilitates their involvement in social, economic, cultural, and political life. Education is a portable asset. An old Sanskrit verse signifies the importance of education. And I quote from the Sanskrit here, which says, Naturyan harya natarajya harya navati vajim navatakari be krite vartate eva nityam vidyadhanam sarvadhanam pradhanam, which means that knowledge is such that a thief cannot steal, king or government cannot snatch, siblings cannot ask for a share. It is never a burden. You do not have to carry it as a burden, and it only increases after spending it. And therefore, the wealth of knowledge is the foremost of all other wealthy possessions. There is growing recognition that the provision of education in conflict-affected settings needs to account not only for the technical challenges such as the lack of school buildings, textbooks, trained teachers, and institutional capacities, which are undoubtedly crucial, but also broader security and political economy factors, including the distribution of power and wealth between different groups and individuals, and the processes that create, sustain, and transform these relationships over time. And I quote Collinson here. In this domain, education and conflict field can be loosely portrayed under 5 main thematic areas. First, education as conflict hardening process. That education hardens conflict. It is a process of cultivating national identity and collective imaginations among citizens through which loyalty towards national ideals, national sovereignty, territorial integrity, linguistic and cultural distinction, and glorified national histories is reproduced. Education can be complicit in producing virulent and exclusionary nationalisms that inspires devotion to one's community or love of country for others. It is linked to feeling of fear, anger, revenge, and resentment. And I quote UNESCO 2018 piece. In conflict-affected context, as a scholar Ben Porath, drawing upon her work in Israel, argues citizen identities are recreated as belligerent citizens. As a response to perceived threats to national and personal security, here the notion of democratic citizenship is reinterpreted in 3 domains. Firstly, the nature of civic participation during periods of conflict is securitized and shifted from open and voluntary civic engagement to directed and mandated participation, in which citizens are expected to be compliant and contributing to the war and security measures. Secondly, violent conflicts fuel overpowering patriotic unity and undermine tolerant pluralism. In this process, democratic contestations are compromised in the name of national solidarity and patriotism. Finally, public debates on controversial social and political issues are discouraged. Public agenda, often dominated by security issues and commitment to free speech, diminished in the name of national security. To transmit these values to learners and legitimately enhance the civic commitment to future citizens, civic education is particularly used, and I quote here, as the institutional tool. I quote Ben Porath. Hence, education is complicit in hardening uncritical solidarity with violent response to conflict. Secondly, since the events of 9/11, education has been hijacked as a battle tactic to win hearts and minds of the people in conflict zones. The Western countries engaging in conflict in Islamic states such as Iraq and Afghanistan have pursued a politically motivated development agenda that legitimizes the use of education aid to strengthen national defense and diplomacy. And I quote my colleague Mario Novelli here. The outcome of this approach is that the decision about aid allocation is likely influenced by security interests of donor countries. And I quote Mark Duffield's work, rather than educational needs of children in the poorest countries. So essentially, money follows conflict rather than the needs of children. The military involvement which has blurred the lines between security and development work, consequently increasing risks to school children and aid workers in conflict zones, undermining the goals for poverty reduction and skewing education aid towards frontline states. And UNESCO has published a global monitoring report in 2011, which documents a lot of these debates. Thirdly, extremism is increasingly becoming a global concern due to its links with religious fundamentalism and terrorism. And formal education is inadequately equipped to provide learners with critical skills to analyze fundamentalism or to prevent violent actions that are inspired by extremist ideologies. And I quote Lynn David's work here. Atran notes that violent extremism, I quote, is the use of violence in line with an ideological commitment to achieve political, religious, and social goals. In this process, education is implicated in a number of ways, including educational spaces being used to spread extremist ideologies, or formal education failing to challenge the views that learners are exposed to outside the school. For example, the internet, the social media, and community settings. Institutions implementing prevent strategies and being legally required to identify and report signs of radicalism to the authority. For example, in the United Kingdom, as an academic, you are required to report on such activities if you observe them in university campuses. And academics and teachers are required to undergo training to notice signs of radicalism at school and university campuses. The drivers of violent extremism are often presented as push factors. For example, the conditions that are conducive to violent extremism are often presented as these push factors, the structures, the structural context from which it emerges. For example, the lack of opportunities, ethnic and regional marginalization, absence of or weak governance of legitimate state, protracted conflict, collective sense of persecution, and then pull factors, the individual motivations and processes which play a key role in transforming ideas and grievances into violent extremist action. For example, social networks and peer pressures, sense of identity or purpose, ideological attraction, employment, promise of justice, etc. And I quote Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, which has published a report in 2017. Even though education is perceived as mitigation to push factors, the relationship between the lack of education and structural development and violent extremism is empirically unfounded. Fourthly, critical education involves the process of praxis, involving reflexivity, theorizing and transformative action through which learners understand and facilitate change in the world they live. Critical pedagogy is a philosophy of education which unapologetically embraces education as a political process to nurture the struggle for democracy and is primarily concerned with the relationship between education and power in society, and thus uncompromisingly committed to the amelioration of inequalities and social exclusions in the classroom and society at large. And I quote Dadar and colleagues' work here. As learners and educators engage, realize, and reflect on their lived experiences, disruptive modes of thinking can also emerge within what Paolo Freire would term as the banking model of education. The process of conscientization, which is Paulo Freire's term, through critical education enables learners to challenge social injustices and oppressions. From this perspective, conflict as a process of resistance to hegemonic structures is a development success, and I quote Jeremy Rapalai's work, and an opportunity to promote social transformation. Finally, education is a crucial domain for building sustainable peace in post-conflict societies. At structural levels, educational reforms that promote equity and social justice can contribute to build what Johan Galton calls positive peace, a societal condition that is free from not only from physical violence, but also structural violence and conditions of war, such as poverty, discrimination, exclusion, and unequal life chances. And I propose the following theoretical frameworks to offer some modalities for peace building through education. Social justice reforms in education. As inequalities in education are likely to perpetuate social injustices and trigger violent conflict, which I quote FHI 360's work, which I referred to earlier, disruptive educational policies based on the 4R framework, which was developed by colleagues looking at the social justice theory by Nancy Fraser, looking at the 4 concepts of redistribution, representation, recognition, and reconciliation, can promote social justice and build conditions for peace. And I quote my colleagues Mario Novelli, Alan Smith, and Mike Lopez Cardozo here. Global citizenship education. Within institutional settings, the provision of global citizenship education can help learners develop skills for critical inquiry in order to dissect claims that do not stand up to the rigorous scrutiny, logic, and rational inquiry, and enhance their civic and political participation. And I quote UNESCO's recent work in 2018. Education should provide learners with critical skills for civic and political engagement, through which learners adopt dialogue and discussion as constructive and peaceful means to find cooperative solutions to conflicts in society. 3. Promoting political citizenship education. As Lynn Davies proposes an educational model of critical idealism, as opposed to conventional tolerant multiculturalism, it can help tackle violent extremism, as he argues. Anti-extremism education should primarily be concerned with critical political education that enables youth to cast doubts on ideals and to reject uncritical acceptance of single truths. Political citizenship education can promote critical thinking and dialogic skills to enable people to critically engage with dominant cultural, political, and religious ideologies and develop dynamic citizen subjectivities. 4. Improving integrative complexity. There's an emerging body of work on integrative complexity thinking out of University of Cambridge, claiming that educational interventions that help increase cognitive complexity can improve learners' abilities to deal with conflict peacefully. And I quote Savez and colleagues here. It is claimed that low cognitive complexity, characterized by simple, narrow, categorical way of thinking, is a predictor of violent conflict, whereas high cognitive complexity, as manifested through broad, flexible thinking and value pluralism, is capable of appreciating multiple dimensions and perspectives. Based on the assumption that violent extremism is an outcome of constricted view of the world, integrative complexity model can help learners to improve cognitive complexity to question their own beliefs and counter extremist ideologies. Fifth, democratizing belligerent citizenship. And this is a concept by Ben Porath, which I quoted earlier. She argues for expansive education model and outlines three critical aspects of education to combat the belligerent citizenship that is created during the wartime. She argues that schools should diversify the conceptions of patriotism in their civic education. They should promote inclusion of diverse social perspectives and of dialogue as a form of pedagogy, and form student identity on the basis of a shared fate in the society. So finally, in a broad sense, the basic idea of education in conflict-affected contexts is concerned with its potential contribution to peace and social cohesion. I would argue that there are two levels of interventions in and through education for promoting peace in conflict-affected societies. Firstly, from a critical standpoint, education should rupture societal conditions that reproduce structural violence and systemic inequalities. To this effect, educational systems should undergo radical shifts in governance structures, resource allocation, curricular revisions, language policies, pedagogies, and teacher development in order to redress educational grievances of marginalized communities. Even in contexts of protracted crises such as internal displacement and refugee situations, education must be provided equitably to prevent fueling inequalities, to provide a sense of care and dignity to displaced populations, and minimize the loss of important social qualities such as good health, public self-esteem, and hope for the future. Secondly, education's role in promoting the culture of peace is of utmost importance in societies that inherit legacies of violent conflict. Hence, teaching and learning about peace should be the core component of the school curriculum, but should not be restricted to formal educational settings, instead be equally championed through non-formal educational programs, public debates, and civil society activities. Respect for diversity, cultural political citizenship, skills for civic and political engagement, global citizenship education, and critical inquiry are some of the key tenets of peace-building education, which should form the basis of post-conflict educational discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Associate Professor Tejendra Pherali. Is very impressive and it's a very insightful presentation.